Your husband trusted the wrong woman, my mother-in-law whispered as the lawyer slid the papers across the conference table. She said it softly enough that no one else in the room could hear, but the satisfaction in her voice settled deep in my chest like cold rain. I looked down at the stack of documents in front of me, my name missing from nearly every page. 3 weeks after Daniel's funeral, Evelyn Carter sat at the head of the mahogany table wearing black silk and pearl earrings, looking less like a grieving mother and more like a queen preparing to claim her kingdom. Lucas sat beside her, staring at his folded hands instead of at me. My own son couldn't even hold my gaze. I folded the corner of the top page carefully and placed it back on the table. Naomi, the attorney said gently, adjusting his glasses. These revisions were finalized shortly before Daniel passed. Passed. Such a polite word for what cancer does to a man after 36 years of marriage. Daniel hadn't just passed. He faded slowly in front of me, one quiet hospital morning at a time, while Evelyn hovered around his bedside pretending to comfort him. I remembered the smell of antiseptic in those pale hospital hallways, the way Daniel squeezed my hand weaker each day, the way Evelyn always managed to send me home to get some rest, right before lawyers or accountants arrived. At the time, I thought she was helping. Grief makes fools of good women. The house will remain under family management. Evelyn continued smoothly. It's simply too much responsibility for someone your age. Someone your age. I was 64, not 90. But the room stayed silent. Lucas finally cleared his throat. Mom, Grandma's just trying to make things easier. Easier. That word almost made me smile. Nothing about the past year had been easy. Not the chemotherapy appointments. Not the nights I sat awake listening to Daniel struggle to breathe beside me. And certainly not this moment, watching my family erase me while pretending it was an act of kindness. Outside the office windows, downtown Chicago moved like nothing had happened. Yellow taxis crawled through traffic below. People carried coffee cups and shopping bags. Somewhere, ordinary families were probably having ordinary lunches together. Mine was dismantling itself in a law office on the 23rd floor. Evelyn leaned back in her chair, satisfied. You'll still be well cared for, Naomi. I looked at her then. Really looked at her. At the tiny flicker of triumph she was trying so hard to hide. At Lucas sitting quietly beside her like a nervous schoolboy instead of a 40-year-old man. They thought silence meant weakness. They thought grief had made me blind. I picked up the pen slowly and signed exactly where the attorney instructed. Then I placed the pen down with steady hands and smiled politely at my mother-in-law. They mistook my silence for surrender. That was the first mistake they made. The house felt unfamiliar the moment I walked through the front door. Not empty. Rearranged. Like someone had carefully removed pieces of my life while I was too distracted by grief to notice. I set my purse down on the marble entry table and stood there for a moment listening to the silence. Daniel used to leave jazz music playing softly in the kitchen every afternoon. Even during the worst months of his illness, he insisted the house should never feel sad. Now all I could hear was the low hum of the refrigerator somewhere down the hall and the ticking of the grandfather clock near the staircase. The family portraits were gone from the foyer wall. In their place hung a large abstract painting Evelyn had always loved and I had always hated. Cold gray lines twisting against a white background like cracks in ice. I stared at it longer than I should have. Then I noticed the silver frame that used to hold Lucas's college graduation picture sitting face down on the console table beneath it. Someone had not even bothered to store it properly. I picked it up carefully and brushed dust from the glass with my sleeve. Mrs. Carter. I turned toward the voice. Maria, our housekeeper of almost 15 years, stood near the dining room doorway twisting a dish towel nervously in her hands. I did not know you were coming home this afternoon. Home. Even she sounded uncertain using the word now. Neither did I said quietly. Her eyes dropped toward the floor. That was when I understood. People who work in wealthy homes learn quickly when power changes hands. The kitchen smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and fresh flowers. White roses filled the crystal vase I usually kept on the breakfast island. Evelyn's favorite flowers. I opened the refrigerator looking for bottled water and paused. My handwritten grocery lists were gone from the side panel. The photographs Daniel used to tape there during his business trips had disappeared too. Little things. Small enough that another person might have missed them. But grief sharpens strange details. Upstairs, the changes became harder to ignore. My reading chair had vanished from the bedroom sitting area. The closet doors stood open half an inch, and several of my winter coats were missing from the rack. I walked slowly into Daniel's study at the end of the hallway and stopped cold. Evelyn was sitting behind his desk. She looked perfectly comfortable there, reading through a stack of financial folders while afternoon sunlight spilled across the leather surface. She did not seem surprised to see me. "Naomi," she said calmly, removing her reading glasses. "You should knock." For 36 years I had walked into that room without knocking. Daniel used to laugh whenever I interrupted his paperwork with tea or sandwiches. Once, during a snowstorm, we spent an entire weekend in that office eating soup beside the fireplace while he dictated letters and I corrected his spelling. Now his mother sat in his chair like she had inherited not just his company, but his entire existence. "I was looking for some of my things," I said. Evelyn closed the folder neatly. "I had a few items moved upstairs to the guest rooms. It is more practical that way." Practical. Another polite word people use when they are taking something that does not belong to them. I nodded once and looked around the office carefully. Daniel's framed photograph of us from Nantucket was gone from the bookshelf beside the window. In its place stood a silver-framed picture of Evelyn and Lucas at some charity dinner I barely remembered attending. That was when the thought finally settled into place quietly and completely. This had not started after Daniel died. It had started while he was still alive. That night I could not sleep. The rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows while the house settled around me with unfamiliar sounds. Pipes creaked somewhere behind the walls. Floorboards shifted upstairs. Every noise felt sharper after Daniel was gone. I sat alone in the dark, wrapped in the wool blanket he used to keep folded at the foot of the bed, and stared at the empty space beside me. His watch still rested on the nightstand exactly where he left it before his final hospital stay. I had not touched it since. Around 2 in the morning, I finally walked downstairs for tea. The kitchen lights were already on. Harold Bennett stood near the counter, holding a ceramic mug in both hands. He had worked for the Carter family for more than 40 years, first as Daniel's father's driver, later as estate manager after the company expanded. Harold moved slowly now, with the careful stiffness of old knee injuries and long winters, but his mind missed nothing. He looked up when I entered. "Could not sleep either?" he asked quietly. I shook my head and reached for the kettle. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Rainwater slid down the tall kitchen windows in silver lines. Somewhere beyond the backyard hedges, thunder rolled across the lakefront. Harold finally set his mug down. "Mrs. Carter," he said carefully, "there are things you should know." I turned toward him slowly. His expression alone made my stomach tighten. Harold was not dramatic by nature. During the years I had known him, I had seen him remain calm through lawsuits, market crashes, even Daniel's illness. If he looked unsettled now, there was a reason. He reached inside the folder tucked beneath his arm and slid several papers across the kitchen island toward me. Bank transfers, property records, corporate authorization forms. My eyes moved over the dates first. Most of them had been signed during the final 6 months of Daniel's treatment. "I found copies in the downstairs office shred bins," Harold said quietly. "Somebody forgot to empty everything." I picked up one document with trembling fingers. Evelyn's name appeared beside temporary financial authority over several Carter Holdings accounts. Another paper showed Lucas added to restricted company access months earlier. My chest felt strangely hollow. Daniel never mentioned any of this. Harold looked toward the rain-covered windows before answering. "I do not believe your husband saw all the documents he was signing near the end." The kitchen suddenly felt colder. I remembered those final weeks clearly now. The medications, the exhaustion in Daniel's face after every treatment, the stacks of paperwork Evelyn always insisted were routine business matters. "She told him not to bother me," I whispered. Harold nodded once. "And your son listened to her." That hurt more than I expected. Lucas had always adored his father. As a little boy, he used to wait by the front windows every evening for Daniel's car to pull into the driveway. After Daniel became sick, Lucas started visiting less often, always claiming work obligations or travel delays. At the time, I believed him because mothers spend years teaching themselves not to question the people they love. Harold slid one final envelope across the counter. "There is something else." Inside was a printed email chain between Evelyn and a private assisted living consultant in Naples, Florida. My eyes stopped on one sentence immediately. "We should move quickly before Naomi becomes suspicious." I stared at the words until they blurred together. Not grief this time. Clarity. cold and sharp as winter glass. Harold lowered his voice. I think they plan to remove you from the company and the house permanently. Outside, lightning flashed pale blue across the backyard gardens Daniel once spent entire weekends tending himself. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back inside the envelope with steady hands. Then I looked up at Harold for the first time since he started speaking. How much do they think I know? Harold studied me quietly for a moment before answering. Nothing at all. I nodded slowly. Good, I said. The next morning the house smelled like cinnamon and fresh coffee. Evelyn believed polished routines could disguise ugly intentions. She was already seated in the sunroom when I walked downstairs, dressed in cream-colored linen with a newspaper folded neatly beside her untouched breakfast. Lake Michigan shimmered silver through the tall windows behind her. From a distance, she looked like the picture of graceful motherhood people admired at charity galas and country club dinners. Refined, composed, generous. It was almost impressive how carefully she had built that illusion over the years. You look tired, she said without glancing up from her coffee cup. Grief catches up eventually. I poured myself coffee slowly and sat across from her. The china clinked softly against the glass tabletop between us. I slept fine, I replied. Her eyes lifted briefly, then returned to the newspaper. Tiny moments. Barely noticeable. But once you see manipulation clearly, you start noticing every small movement surrounding it. Evelyn had spent 36 years mastering those moments. When Daniel first introduced me to his mother, I was 27 years old and working my first corporate accounting position in downtown Chicago. Evelyn hugged me warmly at dinner that night, complimented my dress, asked thoughtful questions about my family. Then, while Daniel stepped away to take a phone call, she smiled gently and said, "My son has always attracted ambitious women." At the time, I laughed because I thought she was nervous about losing him. It took me years to understand the warning hidden inside that sentence. Nothing with Evelyn was accidental. After Lucas was born, she started appearing at the house almost daily without calling first. Rearranging kitchen cabinets, criticizing babysitters, correcting how I folded towels or seasoned food. Always small enough that complaining would make me seem unreasonable. Daniel used to kiss my forehead afterward and whisper, "That is just how she is." Good men often mistake peacekeeping for protection. So I stayed quiet. Through every holiday dinner where Evelyn controlled the seating arrangements like military strategy. Through every birthday party where she bought Lucas larger gifts than we did. Through every subtle reminder that the Carter family wealth existed. Long before I arrived, I remembered one Christmas Eve nearly 20 years earlier when Evelyn handed me an envelope beside the fireplace after dessert. Inside was information for a luxury fitness retreat in Arizona. "You have looked exhausted lately," she said sweetly while everyone watched. "I thought maybe some time away would help you feel more like yourself again." Lucas was 8 years old at the time. I realized later she had planned the trip during his spring recital week. Daniel told me not to overthink it. "Mother means well," he said. But she never meant well. She operated quietly, patiently, through omissions and timing and polished concern. Even during Daniel's illness, she somehow became indispensable overnight. Doctors called her first. Lawyers scheduled meetings around her availability. Nurses began assuming she made family decisions. Looking back now, I could see exactly when it happened. Not suddenly, gradually, like water rising beneath a locked door while everyone inside pretends not to notice. Evelyn folded her newspaper carefully and looked at me over the rim of her coffee cup. "I spoke with a lovely assisted living consultant yesterday," she said lightly. "There is a beautiful property near Naples with ocean views and full-time medical staff. Women your age often thrive in those communities." Women your age. Again, I stirred cream into my coffee without answering. Outside, gardeners trimmed the rose hedges Daniel planted for me 15 years earlier. He used to joke that roses were high maintenance, but worth the trouble. I watched the petals moving softly in the morning wind and finally understood something painful and simple at the same time. Evelyn had spent decades waiting for this moment. She thought grief would make me disappear quietly. She had no idea grief was finally teaching me how to see. 3 days later, Evelyn announced a family dinner as if nothing unusual had happened. Maria spent the entire afternoon preparing rosemary chicken, garlic mashed potatoes, and Daniel's favorite lemon pie, even though he was no longer there to touch any of it. The dining room glowed under soft chandelier light, polished silver reflecting against crystal glasses that had belonged to Daniel's grandmother. Evelyn believed appearances could rewrite reality. If the table looked elegant enough, perhaps nobody would notice the cruelty sitting around it. Lucas arrived shortly after 6 wearing a navy cashmere coat and the same uneasy expression he had carried since the funeral. He kissed Evelyn on the cheek first. I noticed that immediately. Small things reveal loyalty faster than speeches do. "Mom," he said quietly when he finally looked at me. "You look well." Well, another meaningless word people use when they do not want honest conversation. I smiled politely and folded my napkin across my lap. During dinner, Evelyn controlled every topic with practiced precision. Charity events, stock market updates, a renovation at the country club. She spoke as though Daniel's death had simply created extra paperwork rather than an empty space large enough to swallow an entire family whole. Lucas laughed in the appropriate places, though not naturally. He kept checking his phone beneath the tablecloth between conversations. Nervous habits always return under pressure. Halfway through dessert, Evelyn placed her fork down carefully against the china plate and dabbed the corners of her mouth with a linen napkin. The room quieted immediately. Even Maria paused in the kitchen doorway. "Naomi," Evelyn began gently, "Lucas and I have been discussing your future." I took a sip of coffee without answering. "You have been through a terrible ordeal," she continued. "And at this stage in life, managing a property this size alone may become overwhelming." There it was again. Her voice remained soft enough to sound compassionate to anyone not listening carefully. But I had spent 36 years listening carefully. Lucas cleared his throat beside her. "Grandma found a beautiful assisted living community in Florida," he said. "Private suites. Medical staff 24 hours a day. It might actually be really good for you." I looked at my son quietly. This was the same little boy who used to crawl into bed beside me during thunderstorms because he thought I could protect him from anything. Now he could barely meet my eyes while discussing where to place me like unwanted furniture. Evelyn slid a glossy brochure across the table toward me. Palm trees, smiling retirees dressed in pastel sweaters, oceanfront walking paths. "The transition could happen quickly," she said, "especially since the company board is restructuring leadership responsibilities after Daniel's passing." Restructuring. Such elegant language for removal. I opened the brochure slowly. Inside, someone had already highlighted pricing information and residency terms in pale yellow marker. They had prepared this before tonight, before asking me, before pretending I had a choice. I closed the brochure and placed it neatly beside my dessert plate. "No," I said calmly. The silence that followed felt heavier than the chandelier hanging above us. Lucas blinked first. "Mom, maybe you should at least think about it." "I have," I replied softly. Evelyn straightened slightly in her chair. "Naomi, this is not emotional. It is practical." I looked directly at her for the first time all evening. "You keep using that word," I said. "But forcing a widow out of her home, less than a month after her husband dies, does not feel practical to me." Evelyn's expression tightened for only half a second before smoothing again. But I saw it. That tiny crack beneath the polish. Lucas shifted uncomfortably beside her. "Nobody is forcing you," he said too quickly. I folded my napkin carefully and stood from the table. "Good," I answered. "Then we understand each other." Then I walked out of the dining room while the coffee cups still steamed behind me untouched. The morning after the dinner, I woke before sunrise and dressed quietly in the dark. Chicago was still wrapped in pale blue dawn when Harold drove me downtown in Daniel's old black Mercedes. The leather seats still carried the faint scent of cedar cologne and winter air freshener he always bought from the same little shop near Oak Street. I rested my hand against the passenger door during the drive and watched the city wake slowly outside the windows. Coffee shops opening. Delivery trucks unloading crates onto sidewalks. People hurrying toward office buildings with paper cups warming their hands. Ordinary lives moving forward while mine stood balanced on the edge of something sharp and irreversible. Harold kept both hands steady on the steering wheel. "You are certain about this?" he asked quietly as we stopped at a red light near Michigan Avenue. "No," I answered honestly. "But I am finished being afraid." He nodded once after that and said nothing more. Daniel's attorney, Richard Bennett, occupied the corner office of an old limestone building overlooking the Chicago River. Richard had handled Carter family legal affairs for almost 25 years. He attended our anniversary parties, Sent flowers when Lucas graduated college. Sat beside me at Daniel's funeral with tears in his eyes. Which was exactly why his silence during the estate meeting disturbed me more than Evelyn's cruelty ever could. When his assistant led me into the office that morning, surprise flickered across his face before professionalism quickly covered it. "Naomi," he said carefully, rising from behind his desk. "I was not expecting you." The office smelled faintly of leather books and coffee. Rain clouds hung low outside the tall windows. I remained standing instead of taking the offered chair. "I would like copies of every amendment Daniel signed during the last year of his illness," I said calmly. Richard hesitated. Tiny pause. Barely noticeable, but enough. "Those records are complicated," he replied slowly. "Given the family circumstances, perhaps it would be better to discuss these matters with Evelyn present." I almost smiled at that. Evelyn present. As though I needed permission to understand my own husband's estate. "Richard," I said softly, "for 36 years I hosted Christmas dinners for you and your wife. I know when somebody is trying to redirect a conversation." His shoulders lowered slightly after that. The room fell quiet except for the muted hum of traffic below the windows. Finally, he removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose with tired fingers. "Daniel asked me to prepare something confidential 6 months ago," he admitted quietly. "He instructed me not to disclose it unless certain conditions developed inside the family." My heartbeat slowed instead of quickened. Strange how clarity works. Once betrayal becomes visible, fear begins losing its grip. Richard opened a locked drawer inside his desk and removed a thick sealed envelope with Daniel's handwriting across the front. "Naomi. Private." My throat tightened the moment I saw his writing. Daniel always pressed too hard with fountain pens. The letters leaned slightly to the right. I remembered him signing birthday cards at the kitchen counter while humming old Frank Sinatra songs under his breath. Richard slid the envelope toward me carefully. He was worried, he said. More than he admitted. My fingers trembled slightly as I opened the seal. Inside were legal documents, trust records, and a handwritten letter folded neatly between them. But one paragraph stopped me immediately. "In the event my wife Naomi Carter is pressured, displaced, or removed from family residence or company leadership through coercive influence, all inheritance distributions connected to Evelyn Carter and Lucas Carter shall be suspended pending independent investigation by the board." I read the sentence twice, then a third time. Daniel knew. Somehow, during those final months while I was focused on keeping him alive, he had already seen what his mother was becoming. Maybe even what our son had become beside her. Richard lowered his voice. "The clause cannot activate automatically, but if evidence of manipulation exists, the board will have legal grounds to intervene." Outside the office windows, thunder rolled softly across the city skyline. I folded Daniel's letter carefully and placed it back inside the envelope against my chest. For the first time since the funeral, I felt something warmer than grief moving quietly beneath my ribs. Not revenge, not anger, certainty. By the following Friday evening, Evelyn was glowing with the kind of confidence only power can give an aging woman who believes she has finally secured her legacy. Carter Holdings hosted its annual winter charity gala at the Drake Hotel downtown, a tradition Daniel maintained for nearly 2 decades. In previous years, he always insisted on simple decorations and generous donations instead of extravagant displays. Evelyn changed that immediately. Crystal chandeliers sparkled above towering white floral arrangements that looked expensive enough to pay somebody's mortgage for a year. A string quartet played near the ballroom staircase while waiters carried silver trays of champagne through clusters of wealthy guests dressed in black tuxedos and designer gowns. Every inch of the evening felt carefully staged, including me. Evelyn personally requested I attend despite my recent emotional condition, as she described it to several board members loud enough for others to overhear. She wanted me visible, quiet, defeated. I arrived alone wearing the navy silk gown Daniel bought me for our 35th wedding anniversary in New York. Maria helped pin my hair that afternoon with trembling hands. "You look beautiful, Mrs. Carter," she whispered softly before I left the house. Beautiful was not the word I felt standing beneath the ballroom lights that evening. Calm was closer. The kind of calm that settles over water just before winter ice forms beneath the surface. Conversations softened slightly as I entered the ballroom. Pity has its own sound among wealthy people. Polite smiles, tilted heads, gentle voices pretending not to discuss your situation while discussing it constantly. Evelyn stood near the center of the room beside Lucas, wearing ivory satin and diamonds that once belonged to Daniel's grandmother. She had positioned herself exactly where every guest entering the ballroom would see her first. Not the widow, the successor. Lucas spotted me before Evelyn did. His shoulders stiffened immediately. Guilt changes posture faster than age ever can. "Mom," he said when I approached. "I did not know if you were coming." "Your grandmother seemed very invested in the idea," I replied evenly. Evelyn turned then. Champagne glass balanced elegantly between manicured fingers. "Naomi," she said warmly, kissing the air beside my cheek. "You made the effort after all." Effort. Another one of her polished little knives disguised as conversation. I smiled politely and glanced around the ballroom. Members of the Carter Holdings board filled nearly every table. Investors, attorneys, old family friends, people who had known me for decades now carefully avoiding direct questions about Daniel's estate. Near the stage, a giant projection screen displayed photographs of the company's charitable projects beneath the words Carter Legacy Foundation. Legacy. Evelyn loved that word almost as much as she loved control. As the evening progressed, I watched her move through the ballroom, collecting admiration like currency. Hands touched her arm sympathetically. Men complimented her strength. Women praised how gracefully she had stepped into leadership after Daniel's passing. Evelyn accepted every compliment with carefully measured humility. Only once did her mask slip. During dinner, I caught her glancing toward my table with the faintest flicker of satisfaction in her eyes. She thought this evening marked the final transfer of power. After dessert, Lucas stepped onto the stage for the keynote speech. The ballroom lights dimmed softly around him. My father believed family was the foundation of everything meaningful. He began, voice steady through the microphone. Several guests nodded solemnly. Evelyn watched him with visible pride. I folded my hands quietly in my lap and listened. Lucas spoke about continuity, stability, the future of Carter Holdings under strong leadership. Then he invited Evelyn onto the stage beside him to sustained applause. She moved gracefully beneath the lights, one hand resting against her pearls while cameras flashed throughout the ballroom. "This company," she said emotionally, "will remain exactly where Daniel always intended. In trusted hands." Around the room, people smiled approvingly. Glasses lifted. Applause spread again through the ballroom like rolling thunder. I joined politely. Slow measured claps against quiet certainty. Because hidden inside my evening purse beside Daniel's handwritten letter sat copies of every document Harold recovered from the shred bins. Every transfer, every signature, every carefully buried detail. And for the first time all night, I noticed Richard Bennett standing near the ballroom entrance, speaking quietly with two members of the board while watching Evelyn very closely. The applause had barely faded when Richard Bennett stepped onto the stage beside Lucas. At first, the guests assumed it was part of the program. Another speech. Another tribute to Daniel. Wealthy people expect ceremonies to continue smoothly, no matter how uncomfortable the truth becomes. Lucas smiled politely and moved aside to give Richard space at the microphone. But I noticed confusion flicker across his face when Richard did not return the smile. Evelyn remained perfectly poised beside them. Champagne glass still balanced elegantly in her hand beneath the ballroom lights. "Ladies and gentlemen," Richard began carefully, "before tonight concludes, there is an important legal matter involving the Carter estate and Carter Holdings board governance that requires immediate clarification." A soft murmur spread across the ballroom. I remained seated near the back wall with my hands folded neatly in my lap. Outside the tall hotel windows, snow had started falling over downtown Chicago, tiny white flecks drifting slowly through the darkness like ash. Evelyn's posture stiffened almost imperceptibly beside the stage podium. Richard removed several folders from beneath his arm and continued. 6 months prior to his passing, Daniel Carter authorized a confidential protective clause concerning inheritance distribution and executive succession. Lucas turned toward Evelyn immediately. She kept her expression calm, but I saw her fingers tighten slightly around the stem of her champagne glass. "The clause," Richard said evenly, "requires board review if evidence emerges suggesting coercive influence, financial manipulation, or forced displacement involving Mrs. Naomi Carter." Silence settled heavily across the ballroom. not dramatic silence. Worse, the kind that arrives when intelligent people suddenly realize they may have applauded the wrong person. Evelyn stepped forward smoothly. "Richard," she interrupted gently. "This is neither the time nor place for complicated legal discussions." Her voice remained composed, but there was sharpness beneath it now. Richard did not move from the microphone. "Ordinarily, I would agree," he replied. "However, several financial transfers and estate revisions require immediate investigation under the conditions Mr. Carter established personally." Two members of the board rose quietly from their table near the stage. One of them, Thomas Green, had worked beside Daniel for nearly 30 years. He looked deeply unsettled. "What kind of investigation?" someone asked from the crowd. Richard opened one of the folders. "Documentation recovered this week indicates significant estate modifications were executed while Mr. Carter was under aggressive medical treatment, including unauthorized transfer attempts connected to Mrs. Naomi Carter's residential rights and executive standing within the company." The room shifted visibly after that. Not loudly. Chairs adjusting. Whispered conversations. Investors exchanging glances over untouched wine glasses. Evelyn's polished confidence began thinning around the edges like old silk pulled too tightly. "This is absurd," she said coldly. "Naomi is grieving and clearly being manipulated by people who do not understand our family." I finally stood then. Slowly, calmly. Every eye in the ballroom turned toward me at once. Lucas looked pale beneath the stage lights. "Nobody manipulated me," I said quietly. My voice carried farther than I expected in the silent room. I simply started paying attention. Richard handed copies of the recovered financial records to the board members nearest the stage. Harold's shred-bin documents. The assisted living correspondence. Temporary transfer authorizations signed during Daniel's chemotherapy treatments. Piece by piece, the illusion Evelyn spent decades constructing began collapsing under ordinary paper and ink. Lucas stepped away from his grandmother first. Just one step, but enough for everyone to notice. Evelyn turned toward him sharply. "Lucas," she said under her breath. He could not look at her. Thomas Green adjusted his glasses while reading through the documents, his expression darkening visibly. "Effective immediately," he announced carefully. "All pending inheritance distributions and executive restructuring actions connected to this matter will be suspended pending full, independent review." The ballroom remained absolutely still. Somewhere near the back, a waiter quietly lowered a champagne tray onto a linen-covered table. Evelyn's face had lost color now, though her posture remained rigid with pride. She looked at me across the crowded ballroom with something close to disbelief. Not anger. Shock. As though she could not understand how the woman she spent decades underestimating was still standing. I held her gaze steadily and adjusted the sleeve of my navy silk gown. "You did not lose because I fought you," I said softly enough that only the nearest tables heard clearly. "You lost because greed made you careless." No one applauded this time. Winter settled over Chicago slowly after the gala. Snow gathered along the sidewalks outside the Carter estate while lawyers, auditors, and board investigators moved quietly through the company offices downtown like shadows in expensive coats. People who once rushed to stand beside Evelyn suddenly stopped returning her calls. Invitations disappeared. Charity committees postponed meetings indefinitely. Wealthy society has a very particular way of punishing scandal. Rarely loud, usually silent. One afternoon nearly 6 weeks later, I stood alone in the library watching movers carry framed artwork from the walls while sunlight filtered pale and cold through the tall windows. The house echoed differently now. Lighter somehow. Evelyn had relocated temporarily to a condominium overlooking the lake after the board froze several financial accounts connected to the investigation. Lucas moved into a hotel downtown soon afterward. He claimed he needed space. In truth, he could not bear the silence inside the house anymore. Every room reminded him of choices he failed to stop. He visited me once during those weeks. Just once. I found him standing awkwardly near the kitchen doorway one snowy evening while Maria prepared soup on the stove. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically, spiritually. Regret ages people faster than time ever will. "Mom," he said quietly, removing his gloves. "Can we talk?" I nodded toward the breakfast table where Daniel and I used to drink coffee every Sunday morning. Snow drifted softly outside the windows behind him. "Lucas," sat across from me staring down at his untouched tea for several seconds before speaking again. I did not think it would go this far, he admitted finally. Grandma said she was protecting the company. The company. Strange how easily people hide betrayal inside practical language. I folded my hands carefully around my mug. And who protected your father while he was dying? I asked softly. Lucas closed his eyes briefly after that. Not dramatic. Just tired. I know, he whispered. I know. For a moment, I saw the little boy who used to leave hand-drawn birthday cards on my pillow every Mother's Day. But children eventually become the choices they keep defending. Love alone cannot prevent that. Your father loved you deeply, I said quietly. But he saw what was happening before I did. Lucas swallowed hard without looking at me. Can you forgive me? The question hung between us while the kettle hummed softly behind the kitchen counter. Forgiveness. People speak about it like a door that either opens or closes forever. But sometimes forgiveness is simply deciding not to carry bitterness into whatever life remains. I do not know yet, I answered honestly. But I am tired of losing myself trying to save everyone else. Lucas nodded slowly. He left 10 minutes later with snow collecting across the shoulders of his dark wool coat as he walked down the long front driveway alone. By early spring, I made my own decision quietly. I sold the estate. Every marble hallway, every chandelier, every carefully polished room where Evelyn spent decades turning affection into competition. The day I signed the final paperwork, I did not cry. I only felt tired in a peaceful sort of way. Harold helped me move into a smaller white cottage near the shoreline in Kenosha, Wisconsin, just over an hour north of the city. 2 bedrooms, blue shutters, a garden large enough for roses and lavender. On warm mornings, I carried tea onto the back porch and listened to the lake water moving gently beyond the trees while sunlight touched the flower beds Daniel would have loved. Sometimes grief still arrived unexpectedly. In songs. In winter coats hanging by the door. In the smell of cedar after rain. But grief no longer felt like drowning. One evening near sunset, I stood barefoot in the garden pressing fresh soil around a new rosebush while the sky turned pale gold over the lake. The air smelled clean and cold and honest. After everything that happened, that honesty mattered more than wealth ever could. Some women survive betrayal by becoming harder. I survived by finally becoming impossible to move.